Welcome! In this two-part series, we're going to use variables and prototyping to create an interactive volume bar for a podcast app. In this first video, we'll create interactions that allow us to change the volume when we tap the buttons. In the second video, we'll add interactions that will change the volume icons and show a high volume alert when the volume reaches certain levels. We'll use variables to capture the different values needed to build this prototype. Variables are stored, reusable values that can be used to build customized interactions with expressions and conditional logic. Using variables means that our prototype will be simple to update if we ever need to make changes in the future. We'll walk through a few examples of this after we've built the volume bar. We've already created the design we'll be using for this tutorial. Grab a copy of the playground file linked in the description to follow along. Let's dive in. Before we start building our interactions, let's take a look at the design. We have two buttons that will increase and decrease the volume, an icon component set that will change based on our volume level, and a component set for a volume display that has a volume container to represent the space between minimum and maximum volume, and a volume indicator that is controlled by the buttons. The indicator has two states, normal and alert. The width of the indicator will be the driver of our interaction. The buttons will change its value, and we will create trigger points in the width that will change our icon variance and set off an alert message. Now we can build the foundation of our interaction. We first need to create a variable that will determine the width of the indicator, aka the volume amount. Click a blank area on the canvas to deselect all layers, and select Open Variables from the Local Variables section of the right sidebar. Click Create Variable and select Number from the dropdown. Rename it Volume and leave the value at 0. We want this variable to determine the width of the indicator. Go to the volume display component set and select the volume indicator layers in both variants. Then, go to the Design panel and click the Variables icon next to the Width property and choose the Volume variable. Did you notice that the volume amount changed? That's because we set the Volume variable to 0, so the width of the indicator is now also 0. Next, we want to define the max volume so we know what our maximum width will be for this layer. Select the volume container layer and notice that its width is 143 pixels. This means that the max width of the indicator should also be 143 pixels. We want to create a variable to represent this value. Open the Local Variables panel again and add a new number variable called max volume and set it to 143. In the Layers panel, select the volume container layers in both volume display component variants, as well as the volume display instance in our design. Go to the Width property in the Design panel and apply the max volume variable. Using a variable to represent the max volume is an example of how we're setting up a configurable prototype. Without a variable, we could just use a literal number in our expression, but this doesn't scale well, especially if we're using these variables in multiple interactions or designs. What if we wanted to change the max volume after we wrote all the expressions? We'd need to adjust each and every interaction. With a variable, we can adjust the value just once, directly from the Variables panel. Now, let's create another number variable to control the increment the volume changes by. Go ahead and create this number variable and name it increment. set it to 10. We'll apply this to our design shortly, but first, let's talk about why we're using 10 as the increment. This number represents how many steps we want to evenly go into our volume container. We'll divide the max volume variable by this number to determine the increment the indicator will change by with each button tap. For this interaction, we want the volume indicator to increase every time the plus button is pressed. In the episode frame, select the plus button and then select the prototype tab in the right sidebar. Click the plus icon to add a new interaction. Our prototype trigger is on tap. Every time this button is tapped, we want to change the value of the volume variable. So, set the action to Set Variable and select Volume. Each time the plus button is pressed, we want to increase the volume amount by 1/10 of the overall max volume. So our new value would be volume plus max volume divided by increment. Let's try it out by selecting our volume design and pressing Shift plus space on our keyboard to open the inline preview. If we want, we can also open this up in presentation view. Click the plus button. Looking good. If we keep clicking the plus button, the volume amount will eventually surpass the volume container. To prevent this, let's add a conditional using our max volume variable. Conditionals allow us to check if a condition is met before performing an action. Go back to the plus button interaction. We want to change the action to use a conditional, so change Set Variable to Conditional. We only want this action to happen if the current volume level is less than our max volume level. So we can write our conditional as, if volume is less than max volume, set volume to volume plus max volume divided by increment. Test your prototype to see if it works. Now we can connect our variables to our minus button so that it decreases the volume amount by the increment. To do that, select the minus button in the episode frame, create a new interaction, and set the trigger to On Tap. And for the action, choose Set Variable. Each time the minus button is pressed, we want to decrease the volume bar by our increment. We'll represent this with an equation using our existing variables. Set volume to volume minus max volume divided by increment. Open the prototype preview and test it out. Looking at our prototype, we could continue decreasing the volume indefinitely as long as we keep clicking the minus button. You might not see it, but if we click the minus button 3 times after the volume amount reaches 0, it would take 4 clicks of the plus button to see it increase again. To prevent the volume bar from decreasing past 0, we can change our interaction to a conditional and set parameters for when the decrease takes place. Let's open the last interaction we made and change Set Variable to a conditional. Now we only want the volume to decrease if it's greater than 0. So our new action is if volume is greater than 0, and our action will be the same as before. Set volume to volume minus max volume divided by increment. Now, the volume will only decrease as long as the volume is greater than 0. Open the preview again to make sure everything looks good. In the next video, we'll add interactions to connect the volume status icons and high volume alert to the foundation we just built. See you there!